December 25th, 2025, Southern Caribbean Sea. While much of the world was wrapped up in the holiday season, 3 Venezuelan naval vessels began a carefully timed move. At 3:41 p.m. local time, radar operators aboard a U.S. Navy ship watched the pattern change in real time. 3 surface contacts, which had been moving on parallel tracks, shifted course almost together. Their headings angled inward, their speed increased, and their formation grew tighter. That was not random. It was Christmas Day, a moment when crews often run lighter watch rotations, and when attention far beyond the region is naturally focused somewhere else. Venezuela understood the timing. Inside the ship's operations center, the report was calm and exact. 3 Venezuelan naval vessels, coordinated course change, closing distance, no raised voices, no dramatic reaction, just confirmation. Because at sea, intent is not always announced over the radio. Sometimes it is shown through movement. These vessels were not simply passing nearby. They were not keeping a cautious distance. They were moving directly toward the U.S. Navy ship's track. The American response came quickly, but it stayed measured. No turnaway, no increase in speed, no sudden maneuver. The ship held its course. That decision mattered. In international waters, consistency can be a form of control. The first side to overreact can give the other side the ability to shape the moment. The captain knew that. The Venezuelan commanders watching their own screens knew it too. The range kept shrinking. 24 nautical miles. 22. 20. The Venezuelan ships transmitted nothing. No AIS signal. No bridge-to-bridge call. No explanation. Just 3 hulls moving with clear purpose. The first radio hail went out. Venezuelan naval vessels. This is a United States Navy warship operating in international waters. State your intentions. There was no reply. The ships continued forward. A second hail followed, this time in Spanish. You're conducting unsafe maneuvering. Alter course immediately. Still, nothing came back. By that point, there was very little room left for misunderstanding. 3 naval vessels, moving in coordination, maintaining silence, and approaching a U.S. Navy ship during a global holiday window. This was not a simple navigation issue. It looked like a test, and the timing looked deliberate. Inside the operations center, sensors were brought fully into the picture. Long-range optics fixed onto the approaching ships. Every small course adjustment, every added knot of speed, every second without a response was recorded and time-stamped. The American ship still did not change course. No show of force, no performance, just discipline. Because in moments like this, especially when the other side may be counting on distraction, the strongest response is not noise. It is control. And as the Venezuelan naval vessels continued closing on December 25th, one thing became clear to everyone watching the screens. This was not about simple navigation. It was about who would give way first. The distance between them kept falling, not with sudden moves, but with steady pressure. 20 nautical miles became 19, then 18. From the outside, there was no dramatic scene. No sharp burst of speed, no wild turns. Just 3 Venezuelan ships holding a steady pace while slowly tightening the geometry of their approach. It was controlled, careful. The kind of move that could be explained away right up until the moment it could not. Inside the operations center, the tactical picture became sharper. The lead Venezuelan ship stayed on a direct intercept course. The other 2 shifted outward by a few degrees, spreading laterally while still keeping pressure forward. To civilian traffic, that might have looked meaningless. To a naval watch team, it meant everything. They were not fully surrounding the U.S. Navy ship. Not yet. But they were shaping the space around it, narrowing the options and creating a tighter decision window. The American response remained unchanged. Course steady, speed steady, posture neutral. That restraint was intentional. In international waters, every movement can be interpreted. Turning away could be presented as backing down. Speeding up could be painted as escalation. The strongest legal and tactical position was to do neither. The Venezuelan ships kept closing, 17 nautical miles. No radio traffic, no courtesy call, no navigational explanation. By then, the silence had become its own message. The officer of the deck ordered another hail. Venezuelan naval vessels, you are closing distance on a United States Navy ship. Recommend immediate course alteration to avoid unsafe conditions. Only static answered inside the operations center. The closest point of approach recalculated again. CPA, 5.2 nautical miles. That number changed the mood across the watch floor. Quietly, not dramatically, but everyone understood what it meant. The situation had moved beyond routine monitoring. It had entered the narrow space where discipline, timing, and restraint decide what happens next. Below 5 miles, intentions become harder to hide. Below 3, they become impossible to ignore. Electronic support systems began recording passively. No interference, no warnings, just listening. Radar sweeps from the Venezuelan ships appeared now and then, low power, surface search mode. They were observing, measuring, and adjusting. The long-range optics zoomed in further. Activity on deck was now clear. Sailors were visible topside, helmets on. Several figures gathered near the forward mounts. Nothing was actively operated, but no one was treating this like an ordinary transit either. The captain watched in silence. He had seen this pattern before. Not in these waters and not on this date, but the method was familiar. Gray zone pressure, close enough to test a response, controlled enough to deny intent. 16 nautical miles. Then the Venezuelan lead ship increased speed slightly, only by 2 knots. A small change, but enough to shorten the timeline. Moments later, the other two matched it. CPA now 4.1 nautical miles, the operations center reported. At that distance, the situation was no longer theoretical. A small mistake in speed, angle, or timing could quickly erase the margin for error, and everyone in the room understood that December 25th had not been chosen by accident. Holiday rotations, less global attention, a narrow window that looked carefully selected. The U.S. Navy ship did not mirror the speed increase. Instead, the captain gave a quiet order. Shift to heightened awareness. Bring additional sensors online. No alarm sounded. No public announcement followed. From the outside, the ship looked unchanged. Inside, it was preparing. On the flight deck, the helicopter team moved with calm efficiency. Power connected, systems warming. Crew members secured themselves in place. It was not a launch order yet, but readiness had moved from theory to reality. Inside the operations center, the watch team tracked every bearing change with exact precision. The Venezuelan ships kept their formation, still silent, still closing. CPA now 3.6 nautical miles. That number settled across the room. Below 3 miles, explanations begin to disappear. Below 3 miles, events can move quickly. Still, the American ship held its line. This was not pride, it was procedure. The goal was not to create a confrontation. The goal was to make sure the next move belonged clearly to the other side, with every detail recorded. The pressure had been applied. Now the question was whether Venezuela would continue pushing forward or recognize just how visible the moment had become. By the time the range dropped below 3 nautical miles, the encounter had entered a more serious phase. At that distance, intent could no longer be brushed aside as coincidence or poor navigation. Every course adjustment mattered. Every knot of speed carried weight. Every second was being documented. Inside the operations center, the atmosphere stayed quiet, but the tension had tightened. Watch standers spoke in short, exact updates, eyes fixed on radar tracks and optical feeds. CPA now 2.9 nautical miles. Still closing. The captain listened without reacting. He did not need more information. He needed the right moment. In modern naval operations, response is not only about speed, it is about timing. The Venezuelan ships held formation. The lead vessel remained close to a direct intercept path, while the 2 ships on either side continued to create lateral pressure. Not enough to force an immediate response, but enough to reduce maneuvering room. It was deliberate pressure. The captain made his decision. "Execute presence measures," he said calmly. The words were simple. The meaning was clear. Inside the operations center, the shift happened immediately, but without chaos. Active sensors came online. High-resolution optics locked firmly onto the lead Venezuelan ship. Advanced tracking remained limited by design. Electronic systems stayed quiet, prepared but unused. This was not about making a threat. It was about removing doubt. On the flight deck, the helicopter crew received the order they had been expecting. Engines came alive, rotors began to turn. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the air, climbing only enough to clear the deck before settling into a low, controlled orbit off the starboard side. No dramatic climb, no sharp maneuver, just a visible signal. From above, the helicopter's sensor suite came fully online. Infrared imaging cut through glare and distance. Electro-optical zoom delivered a clear view of activity on the decks of the Venezuelan vessels. Heat signatures, movement patterns, command positions. Everything was now being captured, time-stamped, and geolocated. The helicopter moved laterally while keeping a professional offset. Close enough to be clearly noticed, but far enough to remain controlled and non-provocative. Then came the next signal. A green optical marker appeared, steady and precise, directed toward the bridge windows of the lead Venezuelan vessel. It was harmless and non-contact, but the message behind it was impossible to miss. On the helicopter's feed, the reaction on the Venezuelan bridge was immediate. Crew members paused for a moment, then began moving with clear purpose. One sailor lifted binoculars, another stepped back toward the interior. The green reflection was visible across the bridge glass. At the same time, the helicopter transmitted over an open maritime frequency. Venezuelan naval vessel. This is a United States Navy aircraft. You are conducting unsafe maneuvering in international waters. Your actions are being recorded. Alter course immediately. The same message followed in Spanish. This time, the answer did not come through the radio. It appeared through movement on the Operations Center display. A small but important change appeared. Contact reducing speed. 26 knots dropped to 24, then 22. Seconds later, the two flanking Venezuelan vessels followed. Their wakes shortened as engine output eased. The tight approach geometry began to loosen. The angles opened just enough to break the intercept pattern. There was no sudden turn, no rushed withdrawal, just a measured step back. The helicopter held position, sensors locked, the green marker steady. It did not chase, it did not crowd the vessels. It simply remained there, observing, recording, and waiting. At 2.7 nautical miles, the lead Venezuelan ship adjusted course slightly. Only a few degrees, but it was enough. It was no longer driving directly toward the U.S. Navy ship's path. Inside the operations center, the update came quietly. Contact is no longer reducing CPA. That was the moment. The challenge had reached its peak, and then it broke. The helicopter made one final wide pass, deliberate and controlled, confirming the change in posture from above. Then it turned back toward the U.S. Navy ship, climbed smoothly, and returned to the flight deck. The wheels touched down, the rotors slowed, the aircraft was secured. The U.S. Navy ship had never changed course. It had never changed speed. The Venezuelan naval vessels remained on radar and were still visible, but they were no longer closing. Their movement had shifted from pressure to observation. No dramatic escalation followed, no warning measures were used, no new confrontation began, yet the result was clear. The U.S. Navy had not taken control through noise or forceful display. It had done it through presence, documentation, and discipline. It had drawn a line quietly, legally, and with every move recorded. In modern naval encounters, control is often established this way, not by the loudest action, but by the side that stays steady long enough for the other side to understand it has been fully seen. Inside the operations center, the first confirmation was not visual, it was mathematical. CPA increasing. That single update confirmed what everyone had already begun to sense. The geometry had changed. On the radar display, the lead Venezuelan vessel's track began to drift away from the U.S. Navy ship's heading. Only by a few degrees, but enough to change the outcome. The two flanking vessels mirrored the adjustment, widening their spacing and allowing the lateral pressure to fade. Speed confirmed the rest. The lead vessel dropped below 20 knots, then 19, before settling into a steady transit pace. The other two followed the same pattern. The optical feeds showed a change topside as well. Sailors who had been positioned near the forward mounts stepped back. Helmets came off. Some crew members leaned against railings, their posture noticeably more relaxed. The body language said what the radio never did. A decision had been made. On the bridge of the U.S. Navy ship, there was no visible reaction, no order to pursue, no shift into a sharper posture. The ship continued straight ahead, engines steady, as if the encounter had never happened. That restraint was deliberate. In moments like this, overreaction can undo the entire outcome. The objective was never to humiliate the other side. It was to end the challenge without creating a new one. Inside the operations center, risk assessments were quietly lowered. Sensors remained active, but the intensity eased. The closest point of approach continued to widen, 4 nautical miles, then 5. The Venezuelan vessels were still present, still shadowing at a distance, but their posture had fundamentally changed. They were no longer shaping the situation, they were responding to it, and that distinction mattered. The helicopter footage was already being processed and archived. Every frame was aligned with radar data, navigation logs, and recorded communications. If anyone later questioned what had happened, the record would speak for itself. The U.S. Navy ship had continued its lawful transit. The Venezuelan vessels had moved in deliberately, and after clear signaling, they chose to ease away. The record did not need much interpretation. Out on deck, sailors returned to their routines. There were no announcements over the ship's systems, no public display of relief, no visible celebration. Professional standards required the watch to continue as if nothing unusual had happened. And in some ways, that was exactly the point. Encounters like this are becoming part of the new maritime reality. Navies now operate closer to one another than before. Political messages are often delivered through course changes, formations, and distance, not through official statements. Pressure is applied quietly, then pulled back just as quietly. What made this moment important was not only how it started, it was how it ended. No armed systems were brought into use. No critical boundary was crossed. No one lost control of the situation. The Venezuelan Navy had tested the edge of the line. The U.S. Navy answered with restraint, documentation, and steady presence. And when that pressure met calm discipline instead of reaction, it began to fade on its own. By the time the range opened beyond 8 nautical miles, the encounter was essentially over. The Venezuelan vessels moved toward the edge of the tactical picture. They were still visible. They were still watching. But they were no longer shaping the moment. The sea returned to its earlier quiet. The horizon looked the same as before. But for the people who had been watching the radar tracks, reading the numbers, and measuring every second, the lesson was clear. At sea, strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is measured in small changes of heading, steady knots of speed, and the confidence to hold course when someone else expects hesitation. And on December 25th, 2025, that confidence ended the challenge without a single round being used. By the time the distance opened beyond 10 nautical miles, the confrontation had already been decided. The 3 Venezuelan naval vessels were still present on radar, but they no longer controlled the encounter. Their tracks now ran parallel, no longer crossing toward the U.S. Navy ship's path. What had begun as a coordinated approach had ended as distant observation. To someone outside naval operations, it might have looked like nothing happened. No dramatic maneuvers, no loud alarms, no dramatic footage of chaos at sea. But modern maritime outcomes are not always defined by visible drama. They are often defined by who controls the pace, who manages the risk, and who is forced to step back first. On December 25th, 2025, Venezuela appeared to test a familiar assumption, that timing could create opportunity, a global holiday, reduced attention, the expectation that a U.S. Navy ship would choose avoidance over resolve. That assumption did not hold. The American response was not forceful in appearance. It did not rely on loud warnings or visible shows of military capability. It relied on procedure, documentation, and restraint applied with precision. Every movement had been logged, every bearing change had been recorded, every second had been preserved across radar, optical systems, and flight data. If the encounter were ever questioned later, the record would show clearly who maintained lawful transit and who applied pressure first. That matters because these incidents are no longer rare. Across the world's oceans, navies increasingly operate in the gray zone, a space between normal peacetime activity and open crisis. In that space, pressure is applied carefully, often without crossing the line that would trigger a larger response. The goal is not always to overpower the other side. Often the goal is to push them into a decision they cannot easily justify. That is what happened here. Venezuela could have continued closing. It could have forced the distance tighter. It could have raised the risk further. But doing so would have meant accepting the consequences legally, politically, and militarily. Instead, it stepped back. The U.S. Navy did not prevail by overpowering the other side. It prevailed by making further pressure unnecessary, visible, and difficult to defend. It held course, maintained professionalism, and refused to let the other side control the story. That message reaches far beyond the Caribbean. It signals that international waters are governed by law, not pressure. That timing and distraction do not create exceptions. And that attempts to create uncertainty without accountability can be answered with calm resolve instead of overreaction. Inside the ship, the watch continued as scheduled. Crews rotated, logs were finalized. The helicopter detachment completed its post-flight checks. The mission never changed, because it never needed to. Transit, presence, stability, this is what maritime power looks like in the 21st century. Not strength performed for spectacle, not restraint driven by hesitation, but control built on discipline, awareness, and the ability to stay steady when the situation is designed to pull you off balance. The next encounter may not happen on a holiday. It may not involve the same countries, the same ships, or the same stretch of water, but the pattern will be familiar. A close approach, silence on the radio, pressure applied through movement, then one decisive moment where one side must choose whether to continue forward or step back. The real question is not whether these challenges will happen again. They will. The question is how they should be answered. Should the United States take a harder posture when challenged at sea? Or is restraint the more effective tool in a world where every move is tracked, recorded, replayed, and judged? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this breakdown useful, subscribe for more real-world naval encounters analyzed through modern doctrine, operational discipline, and the decisions that happen far from the headlines. And if you want to support the channel directly, consider joining the fleet. Because out here, far from the cameras, celebrations, and public attention, some of the most important decisions are made quietly. One course line, one heading change, one moment of resolve at a time.